I flew an airplane that had 8.6 million lines of software code that drove all the sophisticated avionics of an F-35. I wore a helmet like Tony Stark wore in the Iron Man and Avengers helmet.
Hi guys, thanks for tuning into this week's episode on the JobShare podcast. I had a very interesting conversation with a former Canadian fighter pilot named Billie Flyn. Billie actually appeared on the cover of my local newspaper with his retirement announcement, and after reading the article about his life and career as a test and fighter pilot, I knew I had to get in touch with him. I was beyond excited to have him as a guest on my podcast. We talk about what life flying jets to the absolute extreme was like, what sort of challenges you can face as a pilot, and what we really focus on in this episode is how important it is to never give up on your dreams. Billie followed his childhood dream and passion and made an incredible career out of it. Without further ado, let's hear Billie's story. Thanks for joining me. Welcome to the podcast. I really wanted to thank you for joining me this evening to answer some questions I have for you.
I'm super excited to be a part of this, so thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Now, I'd like to first start off with an introduction. If you could introduce yourself to the podcast, and then I can jump into some more technical and job-focused questions to start.
I'm Billie Flyn. For 40 years, I flew fighter aircraft as a fighter pilot and test pilot in Canada, in the United States, and around the world. And I've come now to live up in Beaver Valley near Collingwood to enjoy Canadian winters once again.
And you recently retired, right?
Yeah, I spent 17 years flying as a test pilot for Lockheed Martin, flying F-16 and F-35 fighters for the company that builds them. And I retired just at the end of last year, and then came back here to Canada to be home, back into my homeland.
That's great. So you've spent the first, did you say 23 years working for the Royal Canadian Air Force?
So I went to the Royal Military College, graduated out of Kingston, Ontario. I wanted to be a pilot, but my father was smart enough to tell me that I needed a degree at some point. And then I flew in the Canadian Air Force, and I was the first kid picked to fly the CF-18 now many, many years ago. And it was a trial. It was an experiment to see if young pilots who knew nothing else could adapt to a brand new generation of fighters. An airplane they thought they called it the plastic airplane. They considered it so sophisticated. It was powered by two, in the day, imagine this, two Commodore 64 computers. That's the equivalent computing power to run a Pong or Space Invaders video games. But many years ago, it was thought to be super sophisticated. And I was the first trial guinea pig to see if a young kid could adapt to this new technology and then learn how to fly it. I flew the F-18 for a career in Canada. I finished as the commanding officer of a fighter squadron in Cold Lake, Alberta, and I was the commander of the Canadian F-18 fleet that flew combat over Kosovo and Serbia in the spring of 1999 in a combat operation called Operation Allied Force, a NATO operation to stop genocide in Kosovo, a province of the former Republic of Yugoslavia. And so we flew combat there. And after that, I retired and moved on to be a civilian test pilot. I flew in Germany, lived near Munich, Germany, and I flew a then new airplane called the Eurofighter Typhoon as a German test pilot. And after that, I was poached by Lockheed Martin to come back to North America to fly the F-16 and F-35. I just finished 17 years of doing that.
That's incredible. Now, you just mentioned you were the commanding officer. What did your role look like in that position? Like, what was different from being a test pilot and fighter pilot to becoming a commanding officer?
Well, so at least in the Canadian sense, the commanding officer is in charge of a whole bunch of, in my case, fighter jets. So 22 F-18 fighters. All the pilots needed to fly those airplanes. All the technicians, ground crew we call them, to fix those airplanes and keep them running every day. And then all the administrative staff that it takes to run an organization that's a couple hundred people strong of really talented young pilots and really talented technicians and ground crew to keep the airplanes running. There, even an F-18 back in its day, and if I look back more than 20 years ago, it's still a pretty complicated, pretty complex fighter jet, and it takes expertise in avionics to run the systems in the airplane, electricians to be smart enough to keep the wiring working, engine experts to keep the engines working perfectly, weapons experts to figure out how to build the weapons that go on those airplanes and maintain them. And that's a pretty big squadron full of very talented professionals to make a fighter squadron work. And as the commanding officer, you're in charge of all of it, day-to-day operations, and then most importantly, getting ready for combat, because that's the ultimate job of a fighter squadron, is go to defend your nation or defend the interests of your nation, in our case, in a foreign land.
Right. Would you say you enjoyed that position a lot, or did you find yourself better suited for just actually testing and flying the jets themselves?
Oh, that is a wonderful question, because as a test pilot, you're trained to be an expert, a technical expert with a unique focus on the airplanes or the projects you work on. And as a commanding officer, the most important job you have is to take care of the men and women who work for you, who look up to you, and in my case, to fly a fighter jet. And I can comfortably say that I loved being a commanding officer. I thrived in that position. I was blessed with enormous talent around me, young pilots who wanted to learn to be better, senior pilots who wanted to teach those younger pilots, and an extraordinary cadre of ground crew, of technicians who were as good as any man or woman out there in maintaining airplanes. And that whole 200 plus squadron of people had an infectious attitude of how to take care of each other and how to succeed, and to be enormously proud to be Canadian, as they were. And I loved every minute of my 2+ years in charge of that squadron.
That's incredible. And I'm sure as a young boy, just thinking about what you want to pursue when you're older, I'm sure the sort of things that you accomplished and the titles you held, you might not have even imagined or pictured yourself in. So I kind of wanted to jump back to the beginning, your college experience. I kind of wanted to ask you what that was like, what the training and education was like that you had to go through and complete.
So you're asking great, interesting questions, because I certainly did not have the focus or the insight to know enough, to study enough, to think that I could become a test pilot one day. If we go back even further, my father was a fighter pilot in the RCAF. My mother is a veteran of the RCAF. They met when they were both in the service. And my dad flew fighter jets until I was a teenager. And I grew up on Sundays after church going to the hangar where the squadron had their airplanes, and my dad would let my brother and I sit in airplanes and pretend we were pilots. And that really sparked my fascination with fighter jets. It didn't give me any heads up or any head start on being a pilot. I was no better off than any other person out there, but I certainly knew how cool they were and that I probably wanted to do that. And getting an education for me at the Royal Military College really never fit into that equation in my time there. I was too restless, because what I wanted to do was go fly fighter jets, and I really didn't want to sit in class. It is, for me, a mistake that cost me years afterwards, and 3 master's degrees to eventually catch up in my academic standing to pay back for the years of inattention as a student, because what I really wanted to do was go fly fighter jets. I wanted to go super fast. I wanted to live in that world where it looked super aggressive. It was testosterone driven, and it was everything in the world that I imagined being cool was all about. I had a great opportunity in my college summers to sit in the back of fighter jets at a fighter base and spend my summer flying in the backseat of 2-seat fighters around Cold Lake, Alberta, and get an insight into what the life of a fighter pilot was. That was enough to push me past the years of military college and get me into pilot training, where I clearly understood the work and dedication that was needed, and that'll get into our theme we're going to talk about, the work and dedication that was needed to become a fighter pilot. And if I'd had that insight earlier in military college, I would have done better in my degree studies.
I remember seeing in an interview, you were describing the physical strength and fitness that you have to be able to take charge of jets. So I was interested in what that looked like, how you were able to keep yourself physically fit, and if there were any specific physical achievements that you needed to reach to be able to do the job.
Flying fighter jets is an enormously physically draining, mentally draining task. Things happen, if you're traveling at 9 or 10 miles a second, that's 16 kilometers, 9 or 10 miles a minute, that's 16 kilometers a minute. That's super fast if you watch yourself scoot by the ground. Things happen enormously fast. So it's a fast mental game, and it's a physical game. It involves pulling, in my case, 9 times the force of gravity in an F-16 or an F-35. In a Eurofighter Typhoon, the same. That is physically crippling, enormously punishing. The worst part of it is it does more damage to your body the more years that you do this. And if you're young, maybe you can bounce by. If you're going to fly for a couple of years and then go on to be an airline pilot, maybe you only have to work out a little bit. But if you're going to do this for a lifetime, as I did, you better take this serious, because it's crushingly painful. And why it matters to be in shape is that we need to stay conscious and stay awake and do our task. And in the case of combat, fight against an adversary at 9 times the force of gravity. And so that particular task is really anaerobically difficult, straining your muscles to keep the blood in your head so that you can stay conscious and pay attention to what you're doing. It's aerobically difficult because it goes on and on and on. And so you have to have the fitness to be able to handle that and not get fatigued. And all of that means everyone, man or woman, better figure out what it takes to stay in shape and be ready for this particular kind of flying. And if you don't, there's a hard, true fact that people have died because they've blacked out from the aggressive flying. And so in my case, I used to be a runner. I've ridden bikes for years now, decades really, and a swimmer, and you spend time in a weight room. Not all of those are exclusive to flying airplanes, but they can directly contribute to the ability to go fly an F-35, which I just finished flying, an F-35 every single day in what is a very punishing environment. And you need to be able to come out and do it the next day and the next day. And physical fitness is a big part of that. I talked about the mental element of this job, how things happen so fast. And that's another part of how it doesn't have to be physical fitness, but it does have to be something and a routine for a man and woman to get their head straight every day. The missions as a test pilot that I flew were 5 hours long. I was in the cockpit for 6 hours at a time, strapped in with nowhere to go. And the missions were mentally and physically demanding. And that meant that your head had to be totally focused, totally in the game the whole time. And to prepare for that really meant that you had to, I don't care if you did meditation, I don't care if you worked out in the morning, I don't care if you did yoga, but you had to do something, and you had to get your head straight every single day before these long, mentally tough missions.
Right. So I wanted to talk about, you mentioned how being physically strong is so important for both men and women. I was curious as to how many women fighter pilots they were, or test pilots there are, because of the physical capabilities you need to have. I'm sure women are able and capable of doing the job, but do you have any idea how many women there are?
Well, so let me make it clear that there's no distinction in capability, in talent, in expertise between a man or a woman. There's no gender distinction. To be a great pilot involves some element of natural ability, some aptitude for it. Then it comes down to training and experience. The gender is not a factor in that. There are not a ton of test pilots that are women, but there are lots, and it depends on whether that's the track that someone wants to go down, or do they want to go fly airlines Do they want to go do something else in their life? It applies to men and women. And the percentage, though, of women in military flying jobs in Canada or in the US, which I know well, is increasing all the time. There's no boundaries to that career path. It's really whether someone is interested in following that path long enough to become a test pilot. Even in the case of my world as a civilian test pilot for a company that builds airplanes, do they want to stay long enough in this vocation to get the opportunity to fly for a company like Boeing, like Lockheed Martin, like Airbus?
Well, that's great to hear. I personally just wasn't aware of the men to women ratio, and good that the percentage of women in this role is increasing. That's great. And this might be an obvious question, but I would assume that both of your parents being in the military, they were a big influence and a big part of your decision to become a pilot, right?
My father, as a pilot, I guess was an influence as much because I'd watched him and his peers and how they did their job. I was naive, and having watched my father hanging out with his best friends, the people he flew with, in an environment where everyone trusted everyone else. Everyone's family shared everything with everyone else, as much because we lived in tiny communities out in the middle of nowhere. And everyone had an enormous thrill and joy that they got from their vocation. And I grew up thinking that everyone's dad loves their job like my dad. Everyone's dad hangs out with their best friends every weekend all together. And I didn't realize that really was a unique domain of pilots, and especially fighter pilots. It is an environment where people, men and women now, are enormously passionate about what they do. It is often the coolest thing they've ever done. And they bring that excitement to everything that they have and do in life. Trust me that I've looked for a long time to see if the rest of the world thought that way. And clearly that's not the case. And I didn't know that as a youngster growing up. I just thought everyone loved their job as much as my dad. And that became an influence later on when I realized how fortunate I was to get to pursue a vocation that I learned to love as much as my dad did.
That's incredible. And I wanted to make a distinction, or perhaps you could. When you started off working for the Royal Canadian Air Force, were you testing pilots for them, or were you a fighter pilot? And do you mind differentiating what it means to be a test pilot versus a fighter pilot?
Sure. So in the Canadian Air Force, like in England, like in the United States, in the military services, we take a group of folks, men and women, and we help weed out the people that probably don't want to do that, and then look for people who have the aptitude, who have the dedication, and that want to be pilots. They may want to fly fighter jets, but they may want to fly helicopters. They may want to fly bigger airplanes, like transport airplanes that take freight around to combat zones, like a C-17 or a C-130 Hercules in Canada. Or they want to fly helicopters, like search and rescue helicopters that you would see at Trenton Air Force Base down on Lake Ontario, or out on the east coast of the United States, the east coast of Canada. Or they might want to fly patrol airplanes chasing submarines, like is the case for the Aurora pilots on the east and west coast of Canada. So you take a pool of men and women, you teach them how to fly, and then you let them loose to learn their trade, because it takes a while for someone to learn how to be a good, competent pilot. At some point along in that progression, if a man or woman is interested in doing something more technical, then they would apply to go to test pilot school, and the military would send them to a formal test pilot school, 1 year long school, where you're going to learn not just how to fly airplanes, but how to assess an airplane and tell others why it's a good or bad airplane, not why you like it. I don't care why you like a BMW versus a Mercedes, why you like your Ford truck instead of a Ram, your Ram truck. We want to teach people to tell us why one is better than the next. And when you've learned that skill of how to differentiate, how to explain in very technical terms the good and the bad, why things work and why they don't, then you can start becoming a test pilot. And from that point on, you're probably going to test new airplanes. You're going to test new weapons. You're going to test new systems in an airplane, systems that would perhaps, like a radar, see different things in front of the airplane, or or they would sense electrons in the air and how it affects that airplane. You would do testing kind of like that. In my case, I flew fighter airplanes. I read a book called The Right Stuff, and it was written, I'll say, 35 years ago. The movie is certainly 30 years old. Sorry, the movie's, I guess it's older than that, but it was a 3-hour movie. It's about the first series of astronauts and a test pilot named Chuck Yeager, the first man to go faster than the speed of sound. And this movie and this book were about these pilots, these men that possessed a unique trait termed the right stuff, something special that no one else had. That movie and that book is what turned me down the path to want to become a test pilot. I wanted to meet those people. I wanted to be one of them. And that set me on a journey that's gone on for decades and decades now.
Truly, truly incredible. So I definitely understand test pilots, what the purposes of testing would be now, but taking on the role of a fighter pilot, I guess that's more specifically to go fight in combat. If you're a fighter pilot, then you're fighting in a war-like setting, I would assume.
In the end, that's what fighter pilots are meant to do. In our case, in Canada, likely to protect the east and west coast of Canada, to protect the Arctic. And because the Canadian government has interest around the world to maintain peace, Canadian pilots might be sent into combat, like happened 30 years ago in the first Gulf War, and later years into my conflict over the former Republic of Yugoslavia. Kosovo was the main focus. Into Libya. Today, on any day, you'll see F-18s deployed to Romania or to do a patrol over the Baltic. You'll see them involved in operations, usually involving coalitions, which means a group of other nations, other air forces all together, often with the air forces of Central Europe, like think about the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, obviously American forces, British forces. You often see the Canadian airplanes involved in a coalition, in a team with nations from there, air forces from those nations.
Right. And I wanted to circle back to the sort of training that you would receive to become a test pilot. Would you say, and I'm sure you experienced a test pilot simulation sort of setup where you're not actually flying a jet at the moment, but there's a simulation presented in front of you. Would you say that those simulations even remotely compare to the experience of actually flying a jet?
So today, in this day and age, the simulators and virtual reality are so sophisticated, are so realistic that while you are not actually, it's true, you're not actually flying an airplane, virtually everything about the experience is like in a real airplane. Airline pilots are not trained to learn how to fly an airliner in an actual airplane anymore. They do it all in simulators because the simulators are so good. That simulation capability really applies in my world. I flew a simulator that flew exactly like the real F-35. I was the first person to fly an F-35 air show. I created the F-35 demonstration now 3 years ago. And I did virtually all my work leading up to it in a simulator. And when I actually flew and practiced in the real jet out in the air, it behaved exactly like the simulator had for the many, many months that I'd practiced in the simulator. Our sims are so realistic right now that they are the real deal. When you think about VR goggles and what they present in a gaming world, you can imagine that it can be that realistic for a pilot to learn how to fly. And that leads me to another bit, by the way, because the future of aviation is really made for the gamers that are out there right now. I flew an airplane that had 8.6 million lines of software code that drove all the sophisticated avionics of an F-35. I wore a helmet like Tony Stark wore in the Iron Man and Avengers helmet. I looked through the skin of the airplane in the visor on my helmet to see what was underneath the airplane while I was flying along at night in an airplane that was stealthy that no one could see. That kind of sophistication of the information that was presented to me is like you would see in a VR goggles. And And that kind of environment is made for the gamers, people that are out there right now, to their moms and dads, spending too much time in front of on a video game console, but in reality learning traits and skills that they're going to need in the next world of what aviation is going to become.
I wanted to touch on combat missions because I know you were briefly mentioning flying combat missions, and in an article I read that you flew 25 combat missions. So, what exactly is a combat mission?
So depending on what the task is, in our case, it was to drop bombs. You are going to prepare a mission, a flight, with the people from your squadron, some like kind of airplanes, but potentially you're going to plan out an attack, a flight plan with a number of pilots that are going to join your big group. And in my case, I went to combat with 70 aircraft at a time. We, in this case, in our particular case, the Canadians were generally out front as the leaders, and we would plan and direct how we were going to leave from whatever bases we were at, assemble together, meet at a certain spot, and then head into the enemy territory, protect ourselves because the enemy was going to shoot at us, drop the bombs and attack the areas that we had been told to attack, and then come out together and leave or egress the enemy territory and hopefully all get back safely and then back to our original bases. Those missions, the missions I flew were generally at night, and they took hours and hours. So you were airborne for 4 to 6 to 8 hours on your way to enemy territory and then on your way back. And the planning for that was usually done the day prior, 24 hours prior, because it was so complex, so complicated, and involved so much coordination with other fighters, amongst the other fighters and the other airplanes that we needed to either get us aerial refuel us and give us fuel beforehand or give us fuel on the way home to get back home. Combat in itself is like an entirely different ballgame than any practice or peacetime mission that you've flown, because it's all the marbles. It's for real. People are going to shoot at you. And if you don't know your game, if you haven't paid attention for all the years, if you hadn't trained like you should have, then it's all going to get flushed out in a combat mission. And it really is where you separate reality from make-believe. And in the old adage, you separate the men from the boys. You find out who are the pretenders and who are the people that were really serious about their vocation. Because when things go wrong, they really, really go wrong. And you have to be at the very, very best every time you fly. And again, the stakes are enormous. If you don't take care of yourself and your wingmen, the other people that you're flying with, then they may not come home. So it means that everyone's relying on you and you're relying on everyone else.
Being a fighter pilot, when you joined the military, was your drive and your purpose, like, I'm sure it might have been both, but I'm curious, were you equally as dedicated to it to serve your country? Or because I hear you explain and describe the feeling of flying and being a pilot is truly incredible, but you got both of those aspects with the being in the Royal Canadian Air Force, serving your country and getting to fly. So, I guess I'm trying to think of what a good question there would be.
I can answer that because and I'm still known as, no matter where I am in the world, as the Canadian. I was enormously proud to be part of the Canadian Air Force. I was enormously proud everywhere I went. And I flew with pilots who were also just as proud and patriotic to be Canadian. And that never left me. It never escaped me how fortunate I was to represent my country and all the many opportunities I had. But the second part of your question really gets at the heart of why someone would do this for 40 years. I was blessed with doing something that I loved. I dreamed of it as a kid, and I got to live my dreams. And if I was not insightful as a college student, I was certainly insightful as I flew for a living to realize that I'd been given this enormous privilege, this amazing opportunity to go do something that nobody else got to do. I got to fly airplanes that before anyone else got to touch them. I got to do things in airplanes that had never been done before. And my love for flying, my passion for this vocation is what drove so much of the 5 o'clock in the morning wake ups to go ride my bike for 30 kilometers for 30 something years. It drove all the studying. It drove all the hard work. It was the fire that kept me going for decades and decades. It was all about the flying and the love of it. And I'll offer that this matters to everyone else that's listening out there, because it's not about flying. It could be about music. It could be about someone who wants to be a writer. It could be about being a sculptor. It could be about someone who wants to go into medicine and help other people. It's the passion that distinguishes those who make it and do this and really have a profound effect on their lives and the lives of others versus not. If someone cares that much, then they're going to be the best musician they can be. Then they're going to be the best veterinarian that they can be, that they're going to be the best doctor or the best writer that they can be. And that passion and how you find that is really the key to enjoying life and the success in what we're all pursuing.
Okay, that's beautifully said. I think that might answer a question I had lined up for you because, as you said, you really did live the dream. And I believe you lived a lot of people's dream to pursue the impossible, flying as fast as possible, and really feel like a superhero at times, I'm sure. But many people, I feel like, talk themselves out of pursuing their dreams because they don't think they could make it, or they won't be good enough or smart enough, or what are the odds that they would make it? So, what would you say to those people? And why do you think people aren't following their dreams? Is it that lack of passion or is it something else?
Sunday, Tom Brady, whether you like him or not, won his 7th Super Bowl, the greatest of all time, the GOAT. And you can be certain that his success was not just based on talent, on natural ability, that his success was based on incredible focus and dedication year after year after year. I think anyone that succeeds in life realizes that it's just a ton of work. I think often for people, if they understood that they have the right to dream big and chase down those dreams and not give up, not get dissuaded and talked out of it by someone, more people would be living the lives that they could and that they once dreamed of. Dream big is something I've said for an awfully long time. No one gets to take those dreams away from us. We may choose not to follow through, but people don't have the right to talk us out of it. For so many years, we were limited on what we could do in life, but look at where we're at right now. People are going to space for the first time ever. It's more than 110 years since, nearly 120 years since the Wright brothers first flew. Yet civilian people are going to space. You don't have to be an astronaut anymore. And in our lifetime, every 15-year-old out there is going to have the opportunity to go to space. And you wonder, how is that possible? How can that not be what so many kids would have ever dreamed of? And yet it's here and they can do that. In my case, it was the combination of fate, luck, and choice that got me to do what I wanted to do. But for everybody out there and everyone I see, again, no matter what you do, you don't let people talk you out of what you ever dreamed to be. And there's no timeline on living that dream. Look, there's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You don't become a pilot and life is great after that. You don't win a Super Bowl and life ends there. You don't make a ton of money if that's what you dreamed of doing, and life ends there. It really is that old cliche that life is a journey, not a destination. That the passion of life, the happiness of it all comes from living that life, not from achieving any single goal along the way. And I don't want that to sound like old and archaic, but it really is the true part of people that live dreams. People succeed. They don't have to make it by 18 years old or 24 years old. Life's a long time. And there's a lot of winding of that road that you're following that'll eventually, if you want it bad enough, will take you where you want to go. And if you just never let go of that dream, you have a better chance of actually succeeding and being in the place in life that you wanted to be.
Were you ever close to talking yourself out of following your dream? Did you ever consider and seriously consider any other career paths or options?
I was very fortunate in my timing and really the luck of things to be able to do, again, what I dreamed of doing. But there's a lot of times down the road where it took some of my mother kicking me in the butt to get me back on track to getting my head straight, to not losing my focus. There's a lot of work that mentors had to do over the years, mentors of mine, to help me realize that I wasn't quite going down the right path and I had to head another way. I've never really lost sight of it because I always thought there was something bigger and better out there, and I was lucky enough to chase that. Sometimes the path was not as direct as I would have liked, and that's really a lesson for all of us. Just because we see something out there and we want it right now, that doesn't mean that we're ready for it, and it doesn't mean that we should get there at this instant. And those extra steps to get to where we thought we wanted to go, that took longer and was harder than we thought, may have been in the end better for us. When we fail, we learn from it, we get back up, and it makes us try harder. And I often think that our successes need to come with some failures along the way. Failures keep us humble, they keep us accessible, and when we work through them to achieve success, we have more credibility around the people that we work with and in what we do. And so I think all of that is part of your answer of, just not letting go. Don't let go, and don't let other people talk you out of it.
I was hoping you would say that you were once considering becoming an astronaut. Did you ever think about becoming an astronaut or not at all?
I did, and I pursued that path, and my timing was good, not quite perfect though for that. I learned later in life that my blessings of what I got to do of commanding men and women in combat, which really allowed me to see what my character was, what I got to do as a test pilot, what I was able and privileged enough to fly airplanes that no one had ever flown before, doing things that had never been done before, working on projects that in aviation that someday you'll find in the airplanes that you'll fly for when you're in a WestJet plane or an Air Canada plane that will save lives. I was able to do all of those things. And as a Canadian-born pilot, I was privileged to live in a world that no Canadian had ever been able to do. And so I learned that I've lived a pretty charmed life. My adventures were pretty impressive for what I wanted to do, and I'm pretty satisfied. But I do think, and I said it a little bit ago, I think it's a really interesting time for every young man or woman out there. We're going to space as a civilization. We're going to space, we're going to the moon, we're going to Mars, and there's no one that has a lock on who gets to go do that anymore. You don't have to be a NASA astronaut to go to space. You don't have to be a NASA astronaut to go to the moon. And pretty soon it'll be a matter of fact thing. And isn't that just amazingly cool? Like, how could you not be excited to be 15 years old, to be 18 years old, to be 24 years old right now, knowing that all of that is in front of you?
I wanted to circle back and ask about growing up in the military, what that family life was like for you, and then with your immediate family, kind of what family life was like for you there.
I grew up in small Air Force bases in northern Quebec, in New Brunswick, in south of Montreal. I never lived in a big city till much later in life. I lived in places where you knew all your neighbors, where you never locked the doors of your houses, where everybody had access to a skating rink. We all went to the same school, and you did everything with all your friends because they all lived in your backyards and everything was super safe. I don't know any community like that anywhere in the world. I naively, again, believe that the whole world lived charmed lives like that. Everyone had ice time whenever they wanted. Imagine a single parent or a single hockey player right now thinking that you could have ice time whenever you wanted. That, of course, never existed. I was lucky enough to move around a lot, and lucky enough because I learned to be nomadic, and I learned to adapt to different environments in different classrooms every 2 years. And it became part of how I lived the rest of my life. I moved until recently. I moved every couple of years my whole life around Europe, around the United States. And I always thought that was fascinating. So I lived the good side of that world, of not having roots necessarily, not coming from the same small town or the same place that I'd been born. And I loved that nomadic lifestyle. I loved all that came from small communities and the closeness of small communities. In later life, so imagine as a squadron commander, my now oldest son was 3.5 years old. He lived there in northern Alberta for 2 years, and for a father to have peers living next door, to have other kids that in my case my son could play with every day, was a pretty cool deal. It's hard to believe that he was so fortunate to have all these friends around him all the time with things to do. And that was the benefit of living in a military community.
Would you say you had a good work-life balance, I guess? Like you spent the amount of time that you wanted to with your family, and then spent the amount of time you wanted to in
I can't even let you finish that question because the answer is absolutely not.
there.
Everybody, and I think it's probably true with so many vocations where people love what they do. The person that works, I'm sure, thought everything was normal, but the person left at home probably didn't feel that way. When you fly for a living, it's all consuming. It's from, when the sun rises till the sun sets. You travel a lot, as we did in fighter squadrons, to train, to practice in other places. And when you come home, you're usually so tired that you sleep through the weekend before you start flying again the next Monday. It's a full-on lifestyle. It's full-on every day, all the time, because you're training to get ready to go to war. And there really isn't a lot of break for that. While the community is close and the families are close, there isn't a ton of time spent at home with work-life balance. And I've learned to preach about it later in life when my family grew big, but I certainly did not live that when I was in the middle of the military life of getting ready for combat. It's tough to balance when your real job is to go to war, and to learn the skills to do that, to train everybody so that everybody is ready to do that. That's an enormous effort. And again, we talked earlier, the stakes are so incredibly high. The stakes are life and death. So you can't just slack off and head home early from work. That just doesn't happen in that world.
No, absolutely. In an article I was reading in 1983, in a training run, you were involved in a crash into a snowbank, and it sounded like it was pretty serious. So I just wondered if moments like that ever deterred you from wanting to continue pursuing being a fighter pilot. Were moments like that were you ever just close to walking away?
At Christmas of 1983, I was in the back seat of a two-seat fighter jet that crashed in a snowbank in Springfield, Massachusetts. My parents lived in Connecticut, a place called Hartford, Connecticut, and we were an instructor in the front seat, me in the back seat. We're flying to drop me off there so I could spend Christmas at home, and then he was going to fly the airplane back to Canada to spend Christmas, and then we would have circled around and come back. We hit a snowbank on landing and destroyed the airplane. Broke both his legs severely. I was uninjured. It was a very impressive crash with fuel everywhere. How the fuel did not ignite and burn us up instantly is beyond me even today. He was maimed for life, eventually became a pilot again, but never walked without a limp. And it was stark moments of sheer terror as the airplane disintegrated, and I tried to keep it from tumbling and to keep it going straight, and then eventually getting out of the airplane, trying to help him get out, but his legs were pinned with the metal around the airplane as it had broken apart. I was picked up. So here's what happens after an accident. The fire trucks arrive, and they eventually foamed down and neutralized the fuel that we were all standing in. They extricated the other pilot, and I separately went to a hospital and to give urine and blood samples, which is what we do to make sure we hadn't been drinking alcohol or taking drugs or anything like that. My father, who had been a pilot, as we talked about, came and picked me up. And so this is the comedy of the story. And he gave me, as we were driving an hour drive home, He gave me the little airline-sized bottles of, it was whiskey of Yukon Jack, and he gave me one and told me to drink it, and I sipped it, and he said, no, you need to drink it. And I ended up having 3 of them on the way home, trying to settle myself down. I spent a week at home where my father will tell you that on that Christmas Eve at church, he'd never heard anyone sing louder in his entire life at church than me the day after my crash, because I was so happy to be alive. I ended up, my first time back was in an airplane a week later, where a friend of mine forced me to jump in the front seat of the same kind of fighter jet and fly an airplane from Ottawa all the way back out to Alberta. And I had not expected, but he kicked me in the butt, made me deal with my fears and my anxieties, and put me back on the horse, if you will, get back in the saddle. And I got over the fear. I got over the anxiety, and then pushed that fear away, and it never came back to haunt me after that. That's about as close as I ever came to being scared enough to think I would give this all up. There's lots of moments of, in my career at least, of nearly dying, of things nearly going just horribly, drastically wrong. Sometimes it's the pilot's fault. Often it's the airplane or something that you didn't expect to happen to you. But I never lost the joy and the excitement of the flying. I'm not a person that goes and seeks out danger. There is clearly danger and risk involved in what we do, and you don't get to do this for 40 years if you are too lackadaisical or not serious enough about this. But the risks are very real. If it scares you off, you're not going to stay doing this. It never really scared me off. I always knew what the risks were. I did my best to make sure those risks never came into my cockpit and never got into my head either.
I wanted to ask you what you would tell someone who's really interested in becoming a test pilot, but doesn't really know exactly where to start or who to reach out to or where to even begin. What would you tell that individual?
Well, 2 parts. One, we've talked around the subject. One is, if that's really what you want to do, if you dream of doing that or anything, then you need to go for it. Then you need to go try to make that happen. And you need not to stop until you've actually lived that dream or pursued it as far as you dare go. And people don't get to talk you out of it. And that's important. There's so many stories that I know of, even in my own case, of bosses of mine, of instructors, of teachers trying to talk me out of things. And fortunately, I didn't listen to them, and I got to do what I wanted to do. And I think that's important for everyone out there. Don't let people talk you out of what you want to be and what you think you want to do. If someone wanted to be a pilot in this day and age, I would tell them to go join the military. I would tell them that the RCAF is as interesting and cool flying as anyone could ever imagine. Search and rescue pilots do the coolest life-saving acts every single year. They are true heroes in aviation, and what they do is really, really hard. Flying transport missions, cargo missions around the world into combat zones is really, really difficult. Flying C-17s and C-130Js in the RCAF is a really, really cool task. I love being a fighter pilot. In the future, in the Canadian Air Force, hopefully are F-35s, and that's like flying a spaceship. And if you're a young pilot and you don't think flying the spaceship is cool, then I can't help you there, because I think it is. And so I think the RCF is the right place to go. If someone is good enough to be selected, to get through pilot training, to get to do those things, to get to be a snowbird airshow pilot, demonstration pilot, to be part of any of that, if they get to do that and then want to be a test pilot, then the military will send them to a school that'll put them with other students from, in my case, I went to school with Italians and Brits and a guy from the French Navy, United States Marines, United States Naval Aviators, US Air Force pilots, and you'll learn all together how to learn to be a test pilot and then come back and do something interesting in Canada. There's so much going on in aviation right now. In Canada, a brand new search and rescue airplane, great helicopters to do really interesting tasks, great transport airplanes to do interesting flying, and a future fighter that will be cosmic. I can't think of a better place to start off a career than joining the Air Force.
I think I just have one last question for you. I think. What was your call sign Now, I didn't think to ask you this question. It was someone close to me wanted to ask what your call sign was.
So my call sign is Billie. It always has been. There's nothing to that. But let's be really clear, because you may have seen the original movie Top Gun, and Tom Cruise is itching to release Top Gun 2, and they all have interest. They have cool call signs. It's Maverick. It was Iceman or Cougar back in the original Top Gun. To be really, really clear, you don't get to pick your nickname, your call sign. And it's never something interesting or nice. It is always because you did something remarkably stupid that your friends and peers saw you do that gets you a label that will stick with you the rest of your waking days. It's never complimentary, and it's not meant to be, but it's something you'll be known for 40, 50, 60 years after that. And I know everybody wish they had a name like Val Kilmer did in Top Gun called Iceman, or Tom Cruise, who was called Maverick. That's just not going to happen. That's not the nicknames of the people that I worked with for so many years. You'll be lucky to get out with a nickname, a call sign that can be used in public. And again, you don't get to pick it. So mine's Billie. It's been that way for 40 years. There's nothing else that's going to. I've done all the buffoonery to have earned a call sign that was way worse, but it just never stuck.
Well, I feel really lucky that I got this opportunity to have you onto my podcast. So I really wanted to thank you. I think what you had to say, your messages and your stories was really inspiring. And I think it would be, and for anyone who's listening who would be even just the slightest bit interested in pursuing something like this, really should consider it and take any opportunity you can and follow your passion, because you yourself, Billie, you did, and look at the life that you had.
Thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. Thanks for the invitation, and I love talking to you.